Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And Chris, a lot of times there are storms, hurricanes specifically, floods, tornadoes that go down in history that people remember generations later. I think when I was growing up, my grandmother used to talk about Hurricane Hazel. Did your grandmother ever talk about that or grandparents ever talk
Yeah,
about?
Hazel, Hugo, there were all of those.
Hazel, Hugo, Fran,
Yeah.
Floyd, more recently, Matthew, Florence. Um, but one of these sort of lesser known events, and we'll talk about some of the causes of it, was a flood that hit the mountain regions of North Carolina in July of 1916. And this is a big event that happened, and it really, Chris, sort of mirrors what happened in 2024 with Hurricane Helene, where the mountains got 20, 30 inches of rain. And you saw all that devastating flooding and all that devastation from landslides. Well, it's the same thing that happened, a little different causes, but the same thing that happened in 1916. And when I learned about this, I thought, you know what? This is history you didn't know but should, because I didn't know about this, but I definitely should have.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that we become too familiar with is we think about hurricanes and we think about flooding, and it usually centers, I'm talking about the state of North Carolina, and you're usually talking about the coast, the things that kind of come up and it's coming along the Atlantic and it's going to crash in kind of to the coast of North Carolina. And, Helene basically reminded us that it's not always about what happens in eastern North Carolina, but it's really about Western North Carolina. And honestly, Western North Carolina is no stranger to flooding, as you just mentioned. And this flood in 1916 was really devastating because it ravaged the region. And what I think is really important about this is it isolated communities. But Ray, as we saw just recently, the flood of 1916 changed the course of the rivers. And when you start thinking about that, it just shows you how powerful these floods can be, and how when they come, they ravage communities and towns and villages, but also it's going to make its way from the mountains all the way down to the sea. So the entire state basically experiences the results from the flood. And, as there had been floods in Western North Carolina, the one here in 1916 was one of those that they thought, yeah, it's going to be some pretty bad rain that's going to be coming, but they were completely caught off guard as to what was about to happen and how quickly things began to unravel.
Yeah, one thing you learn from like Hurricane Helene in 2024, and what we also saw down in Texas, what was it within the past year, is how fast floods can go from just minor flooding to that flash major flooding. What was that happened in Texas? It was a camp, wasn't it? And there was
Yeah, the
all those
Camp Mystic.
Camp Mystic. That was it. There was all those people killed, and that's been in the past year. But let's go back to 1916 and stay there. What were some of the causes of the flood? Well, one thing that happened was something that's not impossible to happen, but we don't see it happen that much, at least here in North Carolina, and that is back-to-back hurricanes. And this occurred in July of 1916, which is really out. It's in hurricane season, but it's really outside of when North Carolina usually experiences most of its hurricanes, which would be August, September, even maybe a little bit into October. But in July of 1916, a hurricane that had come up apparently from the Gulf hit the area and just sort of gave everything a nice, good soaking. The problem occurred a few days later. This is about mid-July, July 14 here. Another hurricane hit North Carolina. This one, a Category 4 hurricane. It made landfall around Charleston, South Carolina. It moved inland and then it stalled and dumped more than 20 inches of rain on the ground that was already soaked from the previous hurricane. And it was the combination of the rain from those two storms that brought all the flooding. Then, of course, you get the delayed river flooding, you get the landslides, destruction of railroads, destruction of homes, destruction of lives. That's really what brought this about, this great flood in 1916, was these two tropical systems. And Chris, when you have one tropical system, whether it's a tropical storm or a hurricane, like we saw with Helene in 2024, that can cause major problems. But in 1916, you had that initial storm that came through and then followed up a few days later with this much more powerful system that stalled out over the mountains.
And add to that that these individuals considered this to be the flood that would end all
Yeah.
floods, that they really just had no idea just how big this would be. And you're right, it's something that what they needed was a lot of dry weather. They needed hot, dry weather, which would have helped soaked up some of the water, but they didn't get that. They kept getting hit and hit, and that storm that hits Charleston kind of moves in, and it's a slow moving storm when it gets to Western North Carolina. And you start seeing how that French Broad River just quickly rises, and it rises above, and they have no idea that it's that perfect storm. You've got that storm as the floods are rising, and then here comes the other ones. And I remembered reading, doing the research, and people basically saying that this Asheville, they were referring to Asheville, and they said that Asheville today is absolutely isolated from the outside world. It is a city of darkness, void of ordinary transportation facilities. It finds herself helpless in the grasp of the most terrible flood conditions ever known here. That was in the paper of July 17th, 1916. By the way, that paper was only able to run by using a borrowed gasoline engine to run the presses because everything was shut down. But back then, the only way that you could get word to people was through the printed word. And so, they found a way to basically take pictures and images and to put those on newspapers so people saw that, Biltmore and the Asheville area was completely just. I remember them describing how a wall of water, when these dams start burst opening, and
Mhm.
it just slams into the riverfront of Asheville. And Ray, as we have seen through the technology that we have today and through the events of Helene and all, when water comes, it is an impenetrable force. You cannot stop water. There is nothing, even when the dams break. We saw that with Katrina back in New Orleans. We see it in Helene. There is nothing that can stop the powerful force of water as it hits the way. And that's a scary thing.
Yeah, with hurricanes, we often think about the wind, but what you just talked about there with the water, water is in some ways more devastating than wind. I mean, wind can do a great amount of damage, but water, like you said, once it's unleashed, once that power of that water is unleashed, my gosh, there's nothing. You can put up sandbags, but if you're talking about a rushing river or something like that, Chris, like you said, there is nothing man-made that can stop something like that. You can go to lower ground for wind, but when it comes to water, there's nothing much you can do.
And we have to also understand that there are not just one river we're talking about. We have
Right.
three different types of rivers. You have the French Broad River, you have the Shenandoah, you also have the Catawba River. And so, as one river floods, another river floods, and then the third river floods. And so, as it's going, you see that they are just inundating the area, and it is difficult to grasp the devastation that begins to sweep across the area. The only way that, I mean, I think about this and I can't really picture it because I've never really, I mean, I remember Fran. I remember that was a devastating storm. I remember Matthew. One of the things that I recall is just the amount of water that goes. We are here in Bladen County, and we're near the Cape Fear River, and we have a pretty large bridge that kind of separates, from one side of, the White Lake side, if you will, and then Elizabethtown side. And I remember with Matthew, the rains just kept coming, and it got to the point that they closed the bridge. And the reason they closed the bridge was because not necessarily of the wind, but also of the amount of water that was coming down the mountains and coming down the Cape Fear, crashing into the bridge to the point where they were scared of the structural integrity of that bridge that they stopped traffic. And it was at that moment that we began to understand what true isolation looks like because for those you and I who live on the other side of the bridge and work on this side of the bridge, that was a moment in which we had to say, wait a second, okay, what are we going to do? There's a possibility that you might not be able to get across that bridge for quite some time. So you start thinking about that and you just imagine that amount of water just pushing down. And here we are, and that was several years ago, but I mean, we have this structural bridge that is used day after day after day that, trucks and cars and all of these things are constantly going over, but yet it had to be closed because of the amount of water coming down and the structural integrity possibly compromised. Imagine in 1916, these homes, these businesses, these cities, there's nothing to protect them from what was about to come.
No, and they didn't have warnings, with Florence, with Fran, with Floyd, with Matthew. We had warnings that a hurricane was on its way. Of course, I think with Hurricane Matthew, the amount of flooding took some people by surprise, but we had warnings. They didn't have a National Weather Service or National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that would track the hurricanes as they came in and where the heaviest rain was going to be and all that stuff. I remember talking to my grandmother about Hazel again in 1954. And I've talked to other people at church, a lot of whom have since passed away, and they talk about getting up that morning, and it was just another morning until the weather started to go downhill and people began to realize, oh no, we've got a major situation on our hands. And that was even worse in 1916 when these two hurricanes, especially the second more powerful category 4 that hovered over the region, hit. People didn't get full warnings that this was coming. You talk about the damage that was done to roads, but in 1916, the damage that was done to railroads, almost 900 miles of railroad track were either just completely washed away or severely damaged. Roads were destroyed. The dams were destroyed, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, Chris. Power plants took a heavy lift and heavy damage. Trains and passengers were stranded. Again, they didn't have, oh, well, there's a hurricane coming. We're going to shut everything down tomorrow at 3 o'clock. They didn't have anything like that. Everything was there. The storms came through. Everything was just absolutely gone from the wind, but also from the rain and the river flooding, the landslides. I mean, that's one thing that just, we live here, Chris, in about as flat land as you're going to get in eastern North Carolina. There are no mountains here. But when you go to the Blue Ridge Mountains, as much as I like looking over the side of the road and off in the distance, seeing that blue haze over those mountains, and you're riding through and you see these huge walls of mountain. I mean, can you imagine water just rushing down the side of those mountains and the damage that can do? It just completely amazes me when I think about it and how terrible that must be.
And I go back to, it is history you didn't know but should. And I go back to the stories of those who lived it. And I recall a story from Dr. Lucius Morse from Chimney Rock. And these were the words of the good doctor who said, quote, throughout the night, there were hours of horror. And when daylight came, the worst scene of desolation ever viewed in the mountain became visible. The horrors of that night cannot be told. The rain fell in such silent masses that one seemed to be under a waterfall. It not only undermined houses, but tore them to pieces. The noise of the rain, like continuous thunder, added to the roar of the river, the shock of the mountainsides literally crashing into the valleys. It was, in fact, a cataclysm, such as these mountains have probably not experienced in recent geological periods. you think about that, and this is someone who is living through it at that time and is writing and basically is just talking about how it was amazing that anyone survived, much less that they were able to make it. He finished his writings by saying the people who went through that awful night will never forget the shock of it. And I think it does just remind us of the powerful force of water, but also just Mother Nature. There's so much talk these days about conspiracies, about people controlling the weather and controlling the events that take place. But Ray, Mother Nature is a beast that cannot be defeated. It is something that, just comes that way. We recall just recently that there was talk of a tropical storm that was coming. It was going to turn into a hurricane, and everybody has it just coming straight for us. Just going to be a knockout punch, is what they're talking about. And then, without it, just it's some Fujinora effect. I don't really understand what's happening, but how that storm just makes the sharpest right turn ever. And I mean, just like literally just turns to the right. And we get maybe a half an inch of rain, and we were supposed to get 20 inches of rain. It shows that Mother Nature is a force upon itself. And all that we can do is continue to make sure that we have measures in place so that when these things are approaching, that we have the best measurements available, the best scientific technology available to warn, but to be prepared for those events. I think Katrina has taught us a lot. I think Helene is teaching us a lot, but you can never be fully prepared. You just always have to think about what's my evacuation plan. Doesn't matter where you are in the state of North Carolina. It doesn't matter where you are at these natural events, whether it's a hurricane, a tornado, whether it's a wildfire. We always have to keep in mind, what's my point of exit? What's my recourse? I remember always seeing these hurricane evacuation routes, and you would always just think, okay, that would never apply to me.
Right.
Well, we see the hurricane, the flood of 1916. We see the Hurricane Helene. We see 8 homes on the coast of North Carolina this week. That a storm that didn't even come close to North Carolina, and these homes are destroyed because of just the water that just keeps coming in and in. Mother Nature is something that we always need to be paying attention to, and we need to learn from the past to help us in the present.
And one thing Mother Nature does with these hurricanes, Chris, they seem to always hit at night. They rarely hit during the day. And I don't know why, but it seems like every hurricane I remember, they're always come. Matthew is at night. Florence lasted several days. I remember Floyd very specifically because I was in Fayetteville at the time, and I remember the winds so strong that it sounded like someone was pounding on the brick of the house. I mean, it was like some unseen force. It was the wind, but this unseen hand just kept pounding and pounding and pounding on the side of the house. And it's just that those are experiences you don't forget. Now, for us in southeastern North Carolina, Floyd was bad, but you got up toward, what was it, New Bern up in there. And I remember seeing video of hogs, dead hogs floating in the water, and just how devastating that was. But of course, what happened in 1916? Extremely devastating. People losing their homes, their property, the economic problems. We don't think about that lingered on for decades after that storm. Communities, you've already mentioned this, just sort of isolated, and even today, I remember after Hurricane Matthew, and this was in 2016. um, I had left actually when the storm started getting pretty bad. I'd left and went to a friend's house on the other side of the river, as you said. Um, but when I woke up the next morning, phones don't work, cell phone doesn't work, no power, nothing. And I remember there were several days there where we didn't have electricity, and you felt isolated from the world. What was going on just 10 miles down the road could have been 100 miles. You just simply don't, you feel that isolation that you normally don't feel, especially today. But even in 1916, that isolation must have been psychologically hard because here you think, my gosh, the world has ended and we're the only ones left.
Yeah. And it is something that you look at these foreign nations with the tsunamis and the other things that happen. It affects anyone at any time, everywhere. And so, Ray, I really appreciate you bringing to light something that I did not know, as you mentioned at the beginning. You did not know this is one of those great events in the history of North Carolina that has all been but forgotten, except for the ones who truly lived during that moment. And it needs to be something that is brought back so that we understand um, the difficulties that people experienced in 1916 and how they were able to overcome, how they were able to rebuild. And you will see that after Hurricane Helene, that same resiliency will be seen as well. So there is hope to come from the studies of these events that took place back in the past.
Yeah, people people push on and they push forward, and that's the important thing. I mean, that's what they had to do in 1916. That's what had to do in 2016 and also in 2024. Chris, thanks for another great episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. We encourage our followers to share this episode and our other episodes with their friends and family. Find us on Spotify, find us on YouTube, and wherever else you get your podcast. Until next time, I'm Ray
I'm Chris.
and we'll talk to you later.